The server room went silent except for the hum of $40 million worth of machines that had all, simultaneously, stopped working. Marcus Whitfield stood in the center of it. His tie loosened, his face pale with the particular terror that only a man who has bet his entire company on a single product launch can understand. In 6 hours, Whitfield Dynamics would go public. In 6 hours, the algorithm that powered their flagship AI trading platform would either make history or destroy every job in the building. And right now it was frozen, spitting out corrupted data. And not one of his 12 engineers, Ivy League graduates, every single one, could tell him why. That's when Marcus turned to the one person in the room he hadn't even noticed until that moment. A girl of maybe 17, sitting quietly on an overturned mop bucket in the corner, waiting for her father to finish his shift. "Fix this," he said, half laughing, half desperate, the words dripping with the kind of mockery powerful men use when they've stopped believing anyone can save them. "And I'll give you $200 million. He meant it as a joke. He meant it as a way to release the pressure building in his chest. What he did not expect was for the girl to stand up, walk to the terminal, and start typing. Before we go further into this story, if you believe that kindness deserves a second chance, and that the quietest people in the room often carry the loudest brilliance, hit that like button, drop a comment below, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to the Story Corner, because stories like this one are exactly why this channel exists. Her name was Naomi Osei, and she had spent every evening for the past 3 years exactly where she was that night, tucked into a corner of Whitfield Dynamics' gleaming glass headquarters, doing homework while her father, Emmanuel, pushed a mop bucket down hallways that cost more per square foot than the apartment they shared above a laundromat in Queens. Emmanuel had been an electrical engineer back in Ghana, a man who once designed power grid systems for an entire province before immigration paperwork, unrecognized credentials, and the quiet cruelty of starting over in a new country reduced him to cleaning toilets in a building full of people who had never once asked his name. He never complained. He came home every night smelling of bleach and exhaustion, and he still found the energy to sit with Naomi and check her calculus homework, because he believed, with the kind of stubborn faith that immigrant parents carry like a second heartbeat, that his daughter's mind was going to take her somewhere he never got to go. Naomi had grown up in that building in a way none of the executives realized. While her father emptied trash cans, she had quietly absorbed everything on the whiteboards left uncleaned in the conference rooms, everything scrolling across monitors nobody bothered to lock, everything in the technical manuals stacked by the IT department's recycling bin. She was not enrolled in some elite prep school. She attended an underfunded public high school where the computer lab had 11 working machines for 400 students. But she read. She read the way some people breathe, compulsively necessarily, and over the past year she had been teaching herself the very architecture that Whitfield Dynamics engineers had built their trading algorithm on, simply because it fascinated her, simply because her father's late nights gave her the time and the proximity to learn. So when Marcus Whitfield made his mocking little joke, he had no idea he was talking to someone who had, for months, silently noticed a flaw in the system's data validation layer, a flaw she'd mentioned once to her father in passing, who had gently told her, "Maybe you should tell someone." And she had laughed and said, nobody in that building would ever listen to the janitor's daughter. But now the room was watching her, and there was nowhere left to hide. Her hands trembled slightly over the keyboard, not from fear of the code, but from 30 pairs of eyes belonging to people who had spent their whole lives being told they belonged in rooms like this one. She pulled up the validation logs. She traced the corrupted data back through 6 layers of the pipeline, the same path she had followed 100 times in her head during long nights of homework. And there it was, exactly where she remembered it might be. A timestamp synchronization, error between 2 servers that had been silently duplicating and corrupting trade entries. Every time the system scaled past a certain threshold, a threshold that had never been hit in testing because no one had simulated a launch day volume. It was the kind of bug that hides in plain sight for months, waiting for the one day it truly matters. She didn't announce it with confidence. She said it quietly, almost apologetically, the way people do when they've spent their whole lives being told to make themselves smaller. I think it's a clock drift issue between your primary and backup servers, she said. When the system scales past this threshold, the timestamps don't match anymore, so the validator thinks duplicate trades are new. Once, she pointed at a line of code that had been sitting untouched in the system for 11 months. One of the senior engineers, a man named Tobias Reyes, who had built half of that pipeline himself, stared at the screen for a long moment before his face went white, because he realized she was right. And he realized that in 3 years of testing, not one person on his team had ever thought to check it. They fixed it in 40 minutes. Naomi walked the engineers through the correction herself, her voice growing steadier with every sentence, because for the first time in her life, people were actually listening to her. Not despite where she came from, but because of the strange, specific wisdom that came from growing up in the shadows of a building full of secrets nobody thought she was paying attention to. When the system came back online, clean, stable, humming with the kind of quiet perfection that meant Whitfield Dynamics would survive its own launch day, the room didn't erupt into cheers. It went silent again. But this time the silence belonged to something like awe. Marcus Whitfield stood there for a long moment, staring at the girl who had just saved his company, and then he looked past her, to the corner of the room where Emmanuel Osei stood frozen with his mop, watching his daughter with an expression that no amount of money could ever buy, an expression made of pride so deep it looked almost like grief. Marcus walked over to him first, not to Naomi, and he asked him quietly, "How long have you worked here?" Emmanuel answered, 3 years, sir. Marcus asked what he had done before that. And Emmanuel, for the first time in 3 years, told someone the truth, that he had been an engineer, that he had designed systems that powered cities, that he had a daughter who was smarter than anyone he had ever known, and that he had never once regretted the sacrifice of becoming invisible so that she could someday be seen. Marcus did not hand Naomi a check for $200 million that night, because that had only ever been the desperate joke of a frightened man, and everyone in that room understood it as such, including Naomi herself, who had never once solved the problem for the money. But what happened over the following months mattered more than any single check ever could. Marcus Whitfield personally funded Naomi's full education, not just tuition, but housing, mentorship, and a direct pipeline into the company's engineering division the moment she turned 18. He created a scholarship in her, named for young people from underserved communities who showed extraordinary ability but lacked the access to prove it. And he offered Emmanuel Osei a position, not as a janitor, but as a systems engineer, the job he had been quietly qualified for the entire time anyone had bothered to ask. Naomi Osei is 22 years old now. She holds a degree in computer engineering. She has 3 patents to her name, and she leads a team at Whitfield Dynamics that specifically searches for the timestamp errors, the overlooked bugs, and the quiet flaws that hide in plain sight, because she has never forgotten what it felt like to see something everyone else missed. Her father no longer pushes a mop through those hallways. He walks them now in a suit, greeting the same engineers who once walked past him without a glance. And every single one of them knows his name. If this story touched your heart even a little, if it reminded you that brilliance doesn't care about zip codes or last names, or how much money is in someone's pocket, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that their circumstances do not define their worth. Your support means more than you know, and it helps stories like Naomi's reach the people who need them most. And before we go, I have a small favor to ask. If you made it this far, drop a single word in the comments below. Just the word "seen," because somewhere out there, someone is doing thankless work in the shadows, quietly capable of more than the world has ever given them credit for. And they deserve to know that someone is paying attention. What began as a mocking joke from a desperate man became the moment an entire family's future changed forever. Not because a genius appeared out of nowhere, but because someone finally looked into a corner of the room they had ignored for years and saw a person who had been extraordinary all along. Naomi never needed the $200 million to prove her worth. She only needed one person willing to listen. And in the end, that was worth more than any number could ever hold.